Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
Today, we're diving into something a listener specifically asked about, and it really hits on fundamental rights. We're talking about Delaware House Bill 14, HB14.
Right. Think of this as, well, getting you up to speed on a potential big change in Delaware law.
We've looked at the bill itself, HB14, and also an argument against it passing.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really unpack this proposed constitutional amendment. What's it trying to do, and what are the different takes on it?
Okay, so what's the core idea of HB14? Basically, it wants to add a specific line to the Delaware Constitution, saying there's an explicit right to individual privacy. And it states this right is, essential, and the government can't mess with it unless
the state has a really, really good reason. A compelling state interest is the legal term.
Right, that specific phrase.
And the big question we're exploring, the one you asked us to look into, is, well, does Delaware actually need this? Is it a good protection, or could it maybe cause some unexpected issues down the line?
Let's start with why supporters want this. The bill's own summary, its synopsis, says it's about enshrining this right to individual privacy.
And the reason they give, it mentions concerns regarding the continued effect of existing U.S. Supreme Court decisions, sort of like maybe they're worried those federal protections aren't guaranteed forever.
Interesting. So they're not saying privacy rights don't exist now.
No, not at all. They actually point to the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, specifically the Due Process Clause.
Okay. Refresh us on that.
So Due Process Clause basically says states can't take away fundamental rights without fair legal steps. It's been interpreted by the Supreme Court over, decades as protecting certain privacy rights, even if privacy isn't explicitly written there.
And the bill actually cites some key Supreme Court cases to back this up. First one is Meyer v. Nebraska. That's way back 1923.
Yeah, Meyer is foundational. It said liberty under the 14th Amendment is super broad. It's not just about not being locked up.
It includes more.
Oh, yeah. The court said it includes the right to choose your job, to learn things, to get married, raise kids, basically to live your life and pursue happiness. It set the stage for thinking about personal autonomy.
So the idea is that broad liberty must include privacy.
That seems to be the proponent's angle, yes. Then you jump forward to 1965, Griswold v. Connecticut.
The contraception case, right?
That's the one. And in Griswold, the court found this right to privacy, even though it's not spelled out word for word in the Bill of Rights. They talked about penumbras or zones of privacy created by other amendments.
Zones? Like what?
Like the First Amendment's freedom of association, the Third's protection against quartering soldiers, the Fourth against unreasonable searches, Fifth against self-incrimination. Even the Ninth, which says just because a right isn't listed doesn't mean you don't have it.
So they saw privacy implied in all those.
Kind of woven through them, yeah. Creating a space for private decisions.
And then there's a more recent one they cite, Lawrence v. Texas from 2003.
Yes, Lawrence. That case strongly affirmed constitutional protection for really personal choices. Things like marriage, having kids, intimate relationships. The court talked a lot about personal autonomy and this realm of personal liberty the government generally shouldn't enter.
Almost like defining your own existence.
Exactly. The court used language almost that strong. So supporters of HB14 would say, look, these cases show how important privacy is, how central it is to liberty.
Okay, so putting it all together, the supporters are basically saying the Supreme Court sees these privacy rights, but things can change. Let's lock it down explicitly in our state constitution for stronger protection right here in Delaware.
That sums it up pretty well. Codifying it at the state level gives it another layer of protection, you could say. And it's worth noting, amending the Delaware Constitution isn't easy.
Right, you mentioned that.
It needs a 2/3 vote in both the House and Senate, not just once, but in 2 back-to-back legislative sessions. So it's a deliberate process.
Okay, got the proponent's view. Now let's flip the coin. What about the arguments against HB14 based on that rebuttal document?
Well, their starting point is pretty blunt. They think this amendment is unnecessary, potentially dangerous, and maybe not fully baked.
Unnecessary. Why?
Because, as we just discussed, they argue federal case law already provides significant privacy protections through the 14th Amendment. Plus, they point to Delaware's own constitution.
Which part?
Article 1, Section 6. It protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. That's a core privacy protection right there. So they ask, why add this vague new amendment when we have these established federal and state protections?
Okay, so redundancy is one point. What else?
A huge one is the vagueness. the term individual privacy itself. The rebuttal hammers this point. What does it mean? What does it cover?
It's not defined in the bill.
Apparently not clearly enough for the opponents. They worry it's so broad it could mean anything. Financial records, medical info, online stuff, your texts. This ambiguity, they argue, could lead to, well, a legal mess, lots of uncertainty.
And that uncertainty leads to worries about unintended consequences.
Exactly. They see potential problems bubbling up in a few key areas. Law enforcement is a big one.
How so?
Well, if you have this strong constitutional right to privacy, and the only way the state can override it is with that compelling state interest, the highest legal bar, it could make investigations much harder. Think about getting warrants, accessing databases. They specifically worry about things like sex offender registries or even just routine background checks being challenged.
So needing information quickly could become a problem.
That's the fear, that every request for personal info could turn into a major legal fight demanding proof of a compelling need.
Okay, law enforcement. What about the economy? That seems less obvious.
Yeah, the connection might not jump out.
Yeah.
But the argument is that Delaware thrives partly because it has certain levels of, say, corporate transparency and regulatory oversight.
Right, it's known for incorporating businesses.
Exactly. So if companies could suddenly claim a broad constitutional privacy right to shield financial data or other operational details, it might weaken regulations. They mention things like fighting money laundering, ensuring professional licenses are valid, consumer protection, that kind of thing.
Could make businesses nervous if the rules become unclear.
That's the concern, creating uncertainty compared to other states. And then there's public health.
Public health. How would privacy impact that?
Think about things like tracking infectious diseases, contact tracing. We all just lived through a massive example of that.
Right, COVID.
Yeah. Those efforts rely on collecting and using personal health information. The rebuttal suggests a broad privacy right could lead to constant legal challenges against these essential public health measures, even if protecting public health is itself a compelling state interest. It creates friction.
Constant balancing act in the courts, maybe.
Potentially, yes. Which leads to another point they make. This idea of a judicial power grab, meaning that by using that compelling state interest standard, the amendment could shift power away from the elected legislature, who normally balances these things, and give it to unelected judges.
How?
Because judges would be the ones deciding, case by case, what counts as compelling enough to override this privacy right. They'd essentially be making policy calls based on their interpretation of privacy, potentially overturning laws passed by the General Assembly.
Interesting point. And there was one more major concern, something about federal law.
Yes, potential conflicts with federal law. There are tons of federal laws that require people or companies to disclose certain information. Tax laws, banking regulations, rules tied to getting federal funds.
Okay.
So if Delaware creates this very strong state constitutional right that's maybe harder to overcome than existing federal standards, you could end up with direct clashes. Delaware law says keep it private. Federal law says disclose it.
Which could lead to lawsuits.
Lawsuits, confusion, maybe even Delaware losing out on federal money or programs if it can't comply with federal requirements because of its own constitution. The opponents basically say, if you have specific privacy worries, pass specific laws. Don't use this constitutional sledgehammer.
Wow. Okay. So definitely two very different ways of looking at this. On one side, you have the proponent saying, let's strengthen individual liberty, make privacy explicit in our Constitution, maybe as a safeguard against future federal changes.
Right. A principled stand for autonomy.
And on the other side, the opponents are saying, hold on, it's not needed, it's vague, and it could seriously mess up how government works, how we fight crime, protect health, and even our economy.
It's quite the contrast. And what's fascinating, as you pointed out, is both sides would probably say they value individual rights.
Yeah, they just completely disagree on the method and the potential consequences of this particular method, HB14.
One side's focused on the big principle, the other on the maybe messy practicalities.
So, as you've listened to this deep dive, you've heard the case for HB14 adding this explicit privacy right, building on those Supreme Court ideas.
And you've heard the case against it, arguing it's redundant, way too vague, and could have serious negative ripple effects across Delaware.
The sources we looked at really paint these contrasting pictures of what this amendment means for rights in Delaware. One sees enhancement, the other sees potential danger.
One focuses on the symbolic power and legal reinforcement, the other on the practical pitfalls of a broad, undefined right.
Which really brings us to the core question for you, listening right now. Given these arguments, these different perspectives, what do you think is the best path forward for protecting individual rights in Delaware while also making sure the state can still do its job effectively?
Yeah, it's not a simple answer. We'd really encourage you to maybe look up HB14 itself, read the arguments, think about how these potential changes could impact you, your community.
Definitely. Forming your own informed opinion is key here, especially as this bill might come up again in future legislative sessions. Would you support it? Oppose it? It's worth considering.